So over the course of this year, Disney hasn't been quite doing so well as everyone would expect. I mean, yes, they still make more than other studios, but it's not like the explosive success we've seen a few years ago. And the solution they presented to remedy these problems were the announcement of several sequels including Toy Story, Frozen, Inside Out, and so on. But as we all know throughout Disney's history is just how incapable they are of making quality sequels, mostly due to their focus on direct DVDs and so forth that are absolutely horrible. And the fact that all of these films are happening is just a terrible sign of the entertainment that is to come out of Disney for the future alongside everything else that have become massive disappointments. And today I really just wanted to talk about why Disney needs to stop doing this considering what actually has happened and what they are doing that is overall wrong, because that's what I do. Because I try to live to see the studio actually try to achieve its original goals and succeed out of creative content, but is always stopped by these out of touch executives that never understood the creativity that actually built it. I mean, compared to the remakes and other stuff, the sequels are still the most creative of the bunch that actually could have great stories to tell to expand upon its original, something other studios have done really well like DreamWorks for some of their sequels, and even Disney in some of the case of the movies I love like Tron Legacy. But when it always came to Disney animation, they just never really attempted to actually do so, where the same can be said for the most part in Pixar beyond Toy Story and Dory. How it's just Walt Disney's belief in not doing so really affected their ability here on out for every single animated sequel they have ever produced that people actually hardly ever remember anymore. Because if I'm really honest with you, when it comes to Disney, most people can't even remember what the sequels actually provided because of how bad most of them turned out to be. Something I've covered extensively when talking about Frozen 2 and Ralph Breaks the Internet as their most recent modern sequels, where the last time they really did it was The Rescuers Down Under, which was just a plain movie wedged within the greatest period of Disney animation that no one also remembers apart from its villain, something most sequels couldn't even bother to actually have at all. And this has become a really important conversation when Elemental has become the highest grossing original animated film after the pandemic due to its positive word of mouth from one of the worst opening weekends for a Pixar film, a showcase of the failure of Disney's marketing for their new films, where because of that initial showing, it instead encouraged them to push for more sequels and remakes and anything with existing IP that would make more money with their name alone. I mean, that's not to say they won't stop doing these original stories, because they always will want to, but it's just how the reaction to such things being not received as well from the beginning allows them to go back to do something that was already a hit before, something well liked in the public eye that you would want to see more of. How Disney's current management only focuses on what they own rather than what they could create, and it's become a much bigger problem than they could ever realize in every level of the company, from their movies to their own theme parks. And I just wanted to focus on the major issues that we have already seen in each sequel and the potential sequels of some films that need to be stopped for the better, or actually stopped to rework, in this case to what I've already mentioned in Frozen 2, that they really need more time to do so other than pump it out for the sake of pumping it out. It's not the idea of the sequels that are bad, but it's the execution of said sequels that makes it bad overall. Like how I mentioned before earlier, good sequels actually have come out like Puss in Boots recently, but then again, those things actually come from Disney's rival rather than Disney itself, making such quality, which to be fair for DreamWorks, they still can't actually shy away from making other crap sequels as well, considering what they've done with The Boss Baby and Trolls with their various sequels and continue to do so, where Trolls 3 is also coming out soon, which I hardly understand considering that these films do not need any sequels and continue to decrease in quality for my taste. But in the case of Disney, they just have something that actually stops them from actually making a good sequel, feeling shackled by some force, because the ideas are certainly there for most, but they just screw up every element about it so badly. And this leads us back to the beginning when Walt Disney made The Three Little Pigs becoming a major success during the Great Depression, where because of that success, people actually wanted to see more. The difference at this time was the fact they were still making short films instead, so there wasn't as much as you could really do, featuring new characters like Little Red Riding Hood and The Three Little Wolves, where each one was still a success but not as much as the first, as seen in Walt's eyes, knowing that you can't top pigs with pigs, and how the stories really felt lackluster from the original, being the same thing with nowhere to go. And because of that, he just went on to make different projects including the animated films we all know and love, and continued on until his death, until The Rescuers Down Under was the first major animated sequel that was released by Disney. Just years of original actual projects pushing forth a new era of technology and whatnot you could do in storytelling for a long period of time. And what we got later with The Rescuers Down Under was really lackluster and spearheaded by Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg when they came into the company. It's definitely not a bad film, but it really doesn't offer much either for the main characters from the first, and at least set a new standard for the cap system to be used by Disney for each film after this. It's just one of those films you remember for one character being the villain, and that's virtually it. Hardly remember remembering what the plot was going on and what it really had to actually offer. I mean, it was nice to take place in Australia and some of that to use certain elements around the world, being the rescuers, but beyond that, I really couldn't get invested with the characters or anything it had to say. Kinda stuck in that similar problem that the Three Little Pigs had, and it really showed. Not a bad film, but not particularly something that you would be fond of remembering. And because of that and the success they did after with the Renaissance, it made them stay away from doing sequels for a time in the mainstream animation departments, where instead, as we all know, was actually focused in the direct-to-DVD sequels instead, starting with Aladdin. Now, I won't go into much of these until later, but to just really sum it all up, these are just merchandise films and TV pilots that never saw the light of day except for a few. Some are actually decent, while others are utter trash that most shouldn't actually ever see again. These just show how clearly they had nowhere to go story-wise for some films that ended well and just found ways to extend something in the name of brands and home merchandise that people could actually chew down on, where there was nothing actually beyond that. I mean, it still works to a degree because I watched all of these films as a child, but looking back on it, comparing to the original works, are a night and day difference where the newer characters are non-existent outside of these films themselves, not really adding much importance or actually doing something creative with the world, like how Atlantis was meant to be a TV series but just stitched together instead because of how poorly received it was financially, and so forth with the other films. And of course, because of that, they all suddenly stopped that when the revival era came out, where no real sequels would be produced until after Moana in 2018 with Ralph Breaks the Internet, the first real Disney sequel since The Rescuers Down Under. And as we all know, this entire film fell flat on its face, becoming one of the worst sequels that was ever made, which is actually sad to think about it, considering the success of the original that most of us love, balancing out the hidden gaming world and the potential the internet had for it that was really high. But instead, what we got was squandered to become a brand-ridden mess like the Emoji Movie. Like literally, we have a section of the film that is solely dedicated to jerking Disney off without really adding much to the story. I mean, the princess scene did have a lot to offer, but knowing the circumstances surrounding it and the time we actually spent here and knowing who produced the movie as seen in the opening credits, it just feels so lifeless and corporatized and less story-driven. That seemed dead set on ruining everything special about its original, and that's virtually it. None of the ways they want to forward the story where Vanellope is at is actually done right at all, where they decide to ruin it at every turn from the very get-go when Ralph is in another game, when the arcade is open, how nobody actually seems to care he's doing the same exact thing from the first film where they set up the rules he cannot game jump, where his game almost got shut down because of it, and how human characters in this film are actually also making very stupid choices that lead them to go to the internet as a result. Just various details that stand out a lot more, where it becomes just harder to ignore the nitpicky ones that are actually factoring into the rules of the world. This is a movie that is more of a lesson of what not to do in a sequel and how to actually irresponsibly showcase the realm of the internet that has aged so badly in so many ways in different scenes, and the gross generalization of how to make money online, doing so in such a short amount. A really stupid statement to kids to how it actually works when they themselves actually want to be in this position as a YouTuber, which is frankly a lot harder than it actually seems. And of course, the other nitpicky point that is hard to ignore for everyone is the fact of the legality of what Vanellope is doing. Wherein Ralph broke the human world through the internet, Vanellope instead will be breaking a lot of legal issues for games like Slaughter Race, a character designed for a different game now in a new game which the developers didn't even design or notice. A massive lawsuit that is waiting to happen in that world, thinking of the consequences. How these issues alone and making her go off in her own way, forgoing the original ending of where she was satisfied at, just destroys any meaning to the film and the real life consequences that kids watch. After all, we do live in this age where kids love to use the internet, and without proper guidance can actually be influenced to do very wrong things, which this film didn't really even help at all in that case, where as a result of that, it forgot the story that was supposed to happen at all, even if the original directors did indeed return to this film, feeling like a decision made by Disney's execs rather than its animation department, and something that still kept continuing on as we saw in Frozen 2. And as I already discussed many times, we already saw how bad Frozen 2 ended up, where its choices are actually more painful than Ralph Breaks the Internet because it actually had promise to its story, but rushed to meet Disney's aggressive deadlines. Stuff that both affected this film and the first film, but didn't actually matter when they actually became both billion-dollar successes around the world. They aren't outright terrible films because Frozen still remains to have something pretty good overall, but it's just how rushed in its pacing that only shows how Disney cared about the money-making prospects of something rather than the promising story that actually could have been provided, and still kept doing so with the announcement of Frozen 3. How in this section of the video, I really want to focus on how Frozen 2's story direction is going to make Frozen 3 turn out for the worse rather than the better. This isn't going to say that's going to happen because there is a chance they can actually make something great with the sequel if given enough time, but considering the time of this announcement of what has happened this year and what has already happened with Frozen 2 already, it really does not look promising at all. Because when you look at it, the movie really has so many issues and subplots that need to get solved that have lackluster endings to it, focusing on not being focused at all. Because as we know, Elsa is the main character of this film. The hero is called to do something, but constantly does something to shut her own sister out like she did in the last film, to do something herself without overall learning anything from before, because nobody knows what exactly is happening at all during the course of the films. The spirits of the film aren't making things clear, like how the dam needs to be destroyed or the consequences of Arendelle, where Anna has to constantly play catch up to her sister, figuring things out within a second, while Kristoff cannot think of nothing else other than proposing to Anna when their kingdom is at risk of being destroyed, and how Olaf is actually having an existential crisis while all of this is going down. How it really just packages everything down together so quick that you keep forgetting that other characters in story actually exist, like the Nothodra and the other older Arendellian guards that were trapped down there, because they really don't factor much into the story at all, appearing here and then disappearing until they show up at the end of the film. That would never actually make sense at all. And when you think of those issues and see the documentary that shows they didn't really have much time to figure out this story, then you really get worried for Frozen 3, because it most definitely is going to run into the same issues, especially at a time like this where the strikes are delaying every single film a year from now. Because we already know the attitude that Bob Iger is delivering against the strikes and what he has already done in Disney, making these deals to secure IP to make Disney successful instead with no real creativity whatsoever, where he is the one who decided to announce these projects like Frozen and Toy Story to get something out for financial success, where knowing that attitude is going to cause the story to end up half-baked like Frozen 2 did. Because the ending of this film really left a lot more confused and more destructive, because it really wasn't earned as well as you would think. Like, it leads more questions about where exactly are you going to go in the story since they are now apart. It's just clearly not clear unless you actually gave them time to do it, becoming more harder to figure out something when you build your world out of rushed ideas and nothing more. But at the very least for this, you better actually have an actual villain, because that's something Frozen actually lacked overall for something to go against the story. Because if you don't have that, then you really don't have a story like what we've seen in Frozen 2, how we actually need to see some conflict going on, and we haven't been able to get that. Because after Frozen 2 for Disney, they really stopped doing sequels once again until these announcements down the line. How it showcased a roadblock of ideas that never made sense and destroyed their stories more than you can ever realize. And that is an issue that also played into Pixar's own problems as well beyond Toy Story, except for number 4. These are stuff I mentioned early on, but it still showed the same problem that Disney had with what they were trying to do, like how Incredibles 2 actually ended up. Because it was the most anticipated animated sequels of our lives, where it actually turned out to be quite lackluster nowadays. Nobody actually cares or remembers what actually happened. Because this film really fell into the same problems that modern Disney had with twist villain tropes and sequel tropes, and not really adding anything good from the original, being a dumbed down version of it, making the same mistakes over again. Because like the others, it actually had a lot of promise to it, and I think the visual style of the world was really great, but not as ambiguous as the first that really made you connect with it despite being outdated compared to this one, where it just never really fell through and figured out where it wanted to go. And this is a problem that actually resulted from the horrendous Cars 2 being their first attempt at making a sequel away from Toy Story, and it really did not work at all. This is a film that really showed how to not make a sequel in any way, where compared to how Ralph destroyed his characters, this film just destroys its world from the original, focusing on this spy plot angle and whatnot that never made any sense into the meaning of Cars at all, despite being directed by John Lasseter, who did the original Cars, where as a result, it affected Cars 3 in the end. I mean, Cars 3 isn't bad, and it certainly is very better than Cars 2, but clearly its diminished box office is a result of what happened in the second film, where people just really didn't care enough to follow anymore because of that disappointment. The problem is of course the world building, where you actually have to have good ideas to do so, but just mess it all up for some unexplained reason. How they just made ideas that are supremely flawed that don't actually make sense to the world for some reason, which also actually happened to Toy Story 4. Because looking back on it, we all know how destructive Toy Story 4 is, where announcing Toy Story 5 is just going to make everything worse. Because honestly, you really should have stopped at 3, since it was literally the perfect ending, but chose to do this because Disney just wanted to do so for the sake of it and nothing else. And keep in mind, I do not think Toy Story 4 is bad. It's pretty great on its own for what it did and is as emotional as the other sequels, but just being paired on as a sequel to the original trilogy makes it an overall bad experience for the actual story, forgetting the arcs several characters went through and not making any sense. The most dangerous example of this is how Bonnie actually forgets to play with Woody, even though it was very clear she took an interest to him in the entirety of 3. Like, why is all of a sudden, after everything we've watched, including the Toy Story shorts, should she be acting this way, and why should Woody actually feel the need to abandon that after every arc he actually went through? That this presents how you know after Toy Story 3, there isn't really anything meaningful to continue the story without removing something important to it, and how Toy Story 5 can only keep doing that if it wants to retain such success as this film. Because if they can't do that, then they really can't do anything with these films at all. Because this is a film that proves the idea that some films can only go so far before you start taking away everything special from it, but still done in a way that people can actually agree with it and have a fun time. A prime example of showcasing how they actually can provide a decent story from a sequel, but just not quite there, fumbling in the end with the ideas surrounding it. How people just want to be satisfied by what you already provided, and if you keep extending that, you give people less of a reason to actually be excited and actually understanding what is actually going on in the world. And this finally brings us to films that haven't quite had a sequel yet in Zootopia and Inside Out. Because these were films that were announced before Frozen and Toy Story coming back, where it sets up a lot of questions about them too. I mean, these films certainly have a lot more potential, but then you have to think if it will impress or follow the same path as the rest of these films. Because if it does, it certainly will not look good for Disney at all. Because this is where you have to present the case of Inside Out too, because as reported on Wikipedia, only Amy Poehler is returning as Joy, while Bill Hader and Mindy Kaling are not. Not that I'm upset concerning Velma, but just how the original characters like Disgust and Fear are not going to be back in the sequel, which they were main characters of the very first. Like, how would that actually play out when you don't really have the entire team that made the first film up? I mean, you could get new actors, but it really doesn't actually fit the billing when you're focused on the characters being voiced one way. Like, what is the point if you don't have all the elements that made your first film successful, if your first film already satisfied most of it? I mean, this still is a Pixar film which has more merit to it into creating stories more so than Disney, but it's still the question if it will follow Toy Story and Dory path of actual sequels or Incredibles and Cars versions instead, either being for the better or for the worse, because certainly Disney has not provided that. Because looking back on Disney with Zootopia is another billion-dollar film which actually shows a lot more promise than you actually might think for the most, more so than even Frozen ever could. I mean, it would be interesting to see Nick and Judy's adventures as cops from where they grew from the first and open up in better ways to present the subject matter that was focused heavily on in a semi-subtle way. How it just depends on who runs it and how much time they're actually going to give it that actually matters, where you really do have to stop and pause to actually work out the details out, because it is actually promising and actually could be good in the end. It really feels like there's just so much more that you could do, but just being worked under the time of being announced again by Bob here, who rushes everything out for his own IP-driven focus, makes you more pessimistic and worried to how it's actually going to turn out instead. The ideas are certainly there, but the promise of it certainly isn't. The push that was announced at the beginning of this year just feels like they never really learned their lessons when it comes to half-assing everything of their sequels, to constantly push for something out just because people know it rather than something to promote their newer films for the better. It isn't inherently bad for them to do so, because they still do have a lot more merit and story than the remakes do if done right, but just need to stop doing this because they just don't know how to probably give these films any time to actually fester it and create from it, to actually have something to say that doesn't actually destroy the meaning of the first, actually provided to improve upon it instead of tearing it down completely. And until we actually see those improvements when the films come out, then Disney sequels will forever live as letdowns that add nothing overall when other studios actually lifted them up for the better. How they need to stop doing that, otherwise they will ultimately fail. And with that said, I'm all done, so goodbye.